Thank you. Thank you to Louisa and the Daniel Mitterrand Foundation. Thank you to Francois and the Solidarity group. Thank you already to the interpreters. You do such a brilliant job. And thank you to all of you for being here. Exchange of knowledge and exchange of biodiversity, of seeds, medicinal plants, has never made anyone poorer. Because if I share an idea with you, I have the idea, you have the idea. It becomes twice. If I share seeds with you, I have the seed and you have the seed. That exchange was not piracy. Though a lot of the biotechnology industry tries to say that that was piracy. Piracy begins with new forms of property rights that are created around living systems, seeds, plants, microorganisms. And this began really at the international level with the World Trade Organization. Earlier, you had national laws. France had its laws, we had our laws. There were different laws for artistic work, copyrights, for industrial patents, manufacturing machines, for trademarks, of protecting a particular name for a trade, of design. But they were all distinctive. It's only in the lead up to WTO that the word intellectual property was created as one umbrella term and is defined as property in the products of the mind. The groups that earlier had made synthetic chemicals, which they had also patented. So there is a patent for Roundup that Monsanto owns. Patent for Basta, I think Bayer owns that. But these chemical companies used to make synthetic chemicals and then take a patent on it. And for those of you who don't know the beginnings of the synthetic chemical companies, it really begins with the war. They first designed chemicals to kill human beings. Concentration camps, they used nerve gases to kill the people in the concentration camps. And then they created chemicals to kill people or use as war. Even chemical fertilizers were linked to the war because they were factories that made explosives. And then the chemical factories that made explosives became fertilizer factories. And that's why so many of the bombs used today are fertilizer bombs. Afghanistan, Oslo, Oklahoma, Delhi, Hyderabad, always fertilizer bombs. Now the chemical industry was used to owning synthetic chemicals, but they didn't have any knowledge of the biodiversity of the world because they were trying to replace living systems with chemicals. They were trying to replace organic matter with chemical fertilizers, the pest control systems of biodiverse systems with chemical pesticides, the weed control that good farming does. In good farming, there's no weeds. The presence of pests and weeds are a sign that your farming is a bad model. And I'd like to mention that in 1905, the British sent Sir Albert Howard to India to improve Indian agriculture with chemicals. And he arrives and he says, I found no pests in the field. So I decided to make the pest and the peasant my professor. As a result of which he wrote a book called the Agricultural Testament. That book is called the Bible of Modern Organic Farming. But he learned it from the pests and he learned it from the peasant. So when the chemical industry realized that new technologies had been evolved for splicing genes, yeah? Taking genes from one organism and putting them into another organism through genetic engineering. They said, if we can own this technology, we can then claim we have invented life. But in the process, they changed laws. And earlier, no country had allowed patents on living systems. Patents on seed, patents on life forms, they were just not allowed. The companies got together in the 70s. They called themselves the Intellectual Property Committee. And they worked across United States, Europe, and Japan. This committee called IPC. And they started to plan how they would start taking patents on living systems. They then put into the World Trade Organization a law called the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, particularly Article 27(3)(b). But this agreement removed all restrictions on patenting that our countries had had, that you can't patent a living system. Now that was up for grabs. They had written the law, and they knew what they were looking for. I have called biodiversity the green oil of the future. Just like the last century was a century of fossil fuels that has given us climate change. There is now a scramble for owning life forms. Monsanto would like to own all the seeds of the world, along with Syngenta, DuPont, Dow, and Bayer. They are the 5 big companies. Same companies that gave us war chemicals a century ago. In fact, the German companies were tried after the war in the Nuremberg trials because they had formed a cartel which was called IG Farben. And the ruling was against IG Farben. But then they just changed themselves and said, now we'll own life. Monsanto is on record saying, we wrote the agreement on patenting life. We were the patient, diagnostician, and physician, as I mentioned yesterday. I was very privileged to be invited to a meeting in 1987 where they were formulating all this. So I realized what they wanted to do. And that's when I said, I'm going to save seeds. I'm going to save seeds so that seed can be free. It can have its integrity. It's not owned and patented. It's in the hands of communities. It's a commons. And we started to create community seed banks. But because we didn't want a system by which we'd go to a farmer and say, we'll give you this much to save a seed, because we don't first put money, we first put the ethics and the imperative to work, I realized we had to encourage farmers to use these seeds for production. So we started to promote ecological and organic farming. And local seeds do very well in ecological agriculture. They're not adapted to chemical agriculture. That's why they were called inferior. But when we shift to organic, they're actually superior. They have more resilience, they have more nutrition, they have more taste, they have more quality, they have more pest resistance. They do better at every level, and they can be saved. They are what we call open pollinated. Just like yesterday, there was discussion on open source software. We talk about open source seed that can be exchanged and saved. Now, because seed and knowledge has been exchanged and saved, some people go and get this knowledge for free because everyone's sharing it. And then they take a patent, my invention. I'll give you 3 stories related to biopiracy cases that we have fought. So in 1984, we had a disaster in the city of Bhopal, where a chemical plant owned by Union Carbide leaked and killed thousands of people. That year I started a movement. I put into buckets lots of neem saplings, which is a tree called the Azadiricta indica, and I carried them to Bhopal and launched a campaign, no more Bhopals plant a neem, because the neem is a natural pest control agent. You can eat the leaves, but it also controls pests, not by killing them, but by slowing them up so they can't reproduce fast enough. So it's like a non-violent pest control agent. My grandmother used the neem, my mother used the neem, so we popularized the neem. 10 years later, in those days I used to subscribe to a very expensive journal on biotechnology because I was keeping track of the industry. I think it was $500 a year. I'm turning the pages and I find first invention of neem for pest control. And I'm holding my head. I said, my grandmother used it. 10 years we have a global campaign, and now there's someone saying they've invented the neem used for pest control. So dug it up. Turns out a timber merchant from US was traveling in India and found the women putting neem leaves into the grain bins to control the pests. So he asked them, why are you doing this? And they said, it controls the pests. He was smart enough, he went to the universities and checked, do you do research on neem? And again, people were generous. Scientists like to share their knowledge. They all gave him their papers. He goes back to America and on the basis of the papers files an application for a patent, and he gets it. Then he sells that in a license to a company called W.R. Grace, which is one of the world's biggest chemical companies. And it had contaminated the groundwater outside Boston. A film was made on this. It's called A Civil Action. And it's the women who acted because their children were starting to get leukemia. This company buys the patent on the neem and even sets up a plant in India. The Indian women were paid 2 rupees for a sack full of neem seeds. And then they sell it in the United States as pest control agent. So I built a campaign, 100,000 signatures we collected, and I brought a challenge to the European Patent Office. But of course we don't live in Europe. So I contacted the Greens of the European Parliament. And I contacted EFORM, the World Organic Movement, and said, will you join us for this patent challenge on biopiracy? It was the first biopiracy challenge in the world. We won the first round, and Grace owned this patent jointly with the US Department of Agriculture. And I remember it when we were filing the case, the lawyers of Grace and the US government are pointing to me like this, because they think third world women, like that, objects. She can't be here because she's not a European. So I just smiled and said, neither are you, because they were Americans. And of course the judges said, they dismissed their objection and carried on. They lost the case, they appealed. It took us 11 years, but that patent was defeated on grounds that we had established that this was knowledge, traditional knowledge used. My valley is very famous for an aromatic rice called basmati. And it's used all the time in Indian restaurants. It means the queen of aroma. A company in Texas took a patent on basmati. Now, a patent has about 20 to 30 claims, as they call them. The claim covered the height of the plant from 1 foot to 3 feet. It covered the length of the grain. It covered the aroma, which they can't create. It's in the plant. And it even covered methods of cooking. My grandmother taught me how to cook rice when I was 6 years old. We built up a campaign on this. In this case, I didn't go to the courts. I forced the government of India to go to the courts and to challenge the US patent. But we also did another movement in the US with postcards, which were sent off by churches all over the country. The US Patent and Trademark Office abbreviates to USPTO. And the postcard said, if you don't revoke, which means strike down the patent, we will have to rename you the US Piracy and Theft Office. And they were so embarrassed by this that even before the case was actually decided, they said, we're going to wash our hands of this patent. Monsanto patented an old Indian wheat. As you know, a lot of people are getting wheat allergies. Gluten allergies, as they're called. Why are they getting gluten allergies? We've eaten wheat for centuries. Because wheat breeding is increasingly industrial breeding for industrial processing. And, when you make a nice bread or you make the lovely galette, the normal wheat is fine. But when you have to make bread in a big factory, you need a lot of elasticity because the poor wheat has to get thrown around. Yeah? And that has increased the gluten content of wheat. It's basically related to elasticity. But we make chapatis by hand, and our wheats don't have gluten. So Monsanto came and patented an Indian wheat and claimed ownership of the wheat plant, the seed, the flour, and all products to be made from low gluten wheat. We went to file that challenge. That was struck down. We've done an analysis. We found 9,000 patents, and I'm talking about 3 years ago. And this is something, if those of you want to volunteer for monitoring biopiracy, it's something very easy to do. I can work with Louisa. It's very, very simple because you go to the patent database and you have the traditional knowledge. In India, we are a very ancient society that's been writing texts. The Rig Vedas and the Upanishads and the Charak Samhitas and Ayurvedas are all in writing. So we know what medicinal plants have what property. So we match that to the patent claim. We found 9,000 the last time we looked of Indian medicinal plants. 9,000. Now who takes these patents? The same companies that give us the chemical pharmaceuticals also, for which they also have patents. The very famous case of South Africa, in the Kalahari Desert, a tribe called San used to eat a plant in the desert, which was very good as a hunger suppressant because they walked days, might not find food. Pfizer patented this for an anti-obesity drug. And when the case went to the European Patent Office, because it's an oral culture, they said it couldn't possibly be that tribals know what the properties of the plant are. Just an assumption that people who have lived with biodiversity for millennia, who have sustained their lives with the knowledge of that biodiversity and its qualities, they're just written off as they don't know. But when that knowledge is pirated, the pirate knows. There is increasing evidence, and I didn't carry this book we've written on the biopiracy of climate resilient crops. Now, climate change is becoming so much more obvious today. Climate resilience in a plant is a very complex process. So far, genetic engineering has been done with single genes that express a single toxin. So Bt expresses the Bt toxin. Herbicide tolerant genes are single genes that express resistance to the herbicide. No successful transformation of a plant is known that involves many genes in what are called multi-genetic traits, where many genes must act together. Among these are yield, climate resilience, nitrogen fixing, all of these. 30 years ago when I used to debate the industry, they used to talk about how they'd grow food on the moon. They grow food in the desert, the Sahara. They grow food on toxic dumps. They said they would do anything with genetic engineering. They've got only two applications, Bt, Ht, both toxic products. I now call them poison-producing plants. But they claim they have engineered climate-resilient crops. They haven't, they can't. The last time we looked, they had taken 1,500 patents on climate resilience. Each patent covers all plants and all traits. Heat tolerance, cold tolerance, flood tolerance, drought tolerance, everything. 1,500. Same 5 giants. The old chemical giants, now the seed giants. So we started a big campaign. The climate resilience is not the invention. We anyway, in the seed banks that Navdanya has built, have saved seeds of climate resilience. Seeds that tolerate the salt. So when the hurricane and waves come, crops can still grow. And we did a rehabilitation after the tsunami, rehabilitation after the Urasa cyclones. Now again the cyclone Phelan. If we didn't have those seeds, we couldn't have rehabilitated agriculture. Or drought-tolerant crops, where we can grow crops during a long extended drought. Or flood-tolerant. We have rice varieties that grow 18 feet tall in the Ganges floods. And it's harvested by boat. And when the floods go, it shrinks back. Can you imagine an elastic plant? But it exists. And farmers have bred it. So biopiracy is appropriating the knowledge of farmers and taking a patent on it. Monsanto wants to control the entire response to climate change. First, by taking patents through biopiracy on crops that have resilience to climate change. And now they have bought up a company called Climate Corporation. Climate Corporation is the world's biggest company that manages climate data and weather data. So having bought this company, Monsanto's model of farming is this. Farmer will ring them up and ask what the weather will be like that season, for which they will have to pay for the data. Then Monsanto will say the weather will be like this and these are the seeds that are adapted to this weather which you can buy, that will be patented. So at every step there is claims of ownership. And I feel very happy that years ago Monsanto wanted to privatize water. Someone from Monsanto sent me in the mail their plan. Someone from Monsanto was so disgusted. They just put this in the mail. And the privatization of water basically said, water is becoming scarce, water is getting polluted. The market in water is very sustainable for profits. That's sustainability for them. And then they had said, just like now they've married the seed to the Roundup, they wanted to marry the water to the seed and the chemical. That if you don't buy their water, which has the chemicals, you can't grow the plant. Luckily, I made such a noise about this, they had to withdraw it. But this is the idea of total control. So I'm giving this detail to say biopiracy is not a sporadic phenomena. It's part of a large thinking of owning life and making everyone dependent on buying life, buying everyday life, which means most people can't buy it. That means most people won't live. Today, a small peasant has their seed, they can grow food. Tomorrow, if that seed has to be bought with patents and royalties. They won't be able to grow it. I mentioned in my press conference that 200, and actually the data now is 300,000 with the data I received today. 300,000 farmer suicides because of patenting or because of intellectual property rights. Now, did Monsanto invent the cotton plant that it has a patent on it? Because a patent means an invention, and it means an exclusion of everyone else from using, exchanging, developing, selling what is patented. Indian peasants evolved cotton. Peruvian peasants evolved cotton. They just put a toxic gene into it. So the plant has been pirated. What they've added is a gene. That too, in fact, if you really think of it, is piracy, because the plant has been pirated. Now, there is in France a proposal that will be considered in October for a new biodiversity related law for access and benefit sharing. Now, access is by somebody, for somebody, and the benefit has to be defined. If I have seed and I share with you, all of us have a benefit. If a company takes a patent on a seed, what kind of benefit sharing can they do to the farmer whose rights they have appropriated? In the case of an Amazonian theft, they gave 2 cows to the tribe, 2 cows, which in one day were butchered and eaten and roasted, finished. Not a single bio benefit sharing program has delivered. There was a big program in Costa Rica, didn't deliver. In the case of South India, a research institute with a pharmaceutical company and 2 tribal representatives, but they didn't represent the tribe, they were just tribals. They took a patent on Jivanya, a medicinal plant that gives you energy. It's like, again, you can be in the forest and not exhaust yourself. The tribe is called Kani. Because a patent means the right to exclude others, the tribe itself got excluded from collecting that medicinal plant in the forest. So, if access is defined in a narrow way, in terms of access to privatizing the common good, to exclude the sharing, it is in fact creating new poverty. And it is a threat to biodiversity. So I would suggest that the movements that are here organize to build a huge campaign to say the access can only be given for non-patented relationships. That in any case the biodiversity is not invented, so how can you claim a patent? It's wrong. And benefit sharing should be cooperative arrangements, not appropriating a monopoly and then giving a little bit of crumbs, but equal partnership in the ownership of the business. And that should be negotiated through solidarity organizations. And in fact, if 1 or 2 groups create 1 or 2 examples, that can be absolutely brilliant. There are many ways to resist. In India, what we did when biopiracy started as an epidemic is we had meetings at the level of villages, besides the legal challenges that were made. And we started to create what are called community biodiversity registers. Communities recording their own biodiversity wealth and their knowledge. Old women knew everything, but they didn't know how to write. Young school kids knew how to write, but they weren't being taught about their biodiversity. We put the grandmothers and grandchildren together and said, make a community biodiversity register. The second thing we did is we said, this community biodiversity register is the real record, not a patent office. This is the record of prior knowledge to prevent a patent. We went further. We created living democracy movements of collective ownership over these common goods. And then to WTO, this was fun. We had so many languages and different scripts. We have 25 languages. And I think at least 10 states participated, where farmers wrote on postcards. We still had postcards in that time. On postcards in their language, that biodiversity is our extended family. We notice you are allowing patenting. You don't have the jurisdiction on this. To the WTO they wrote. And we'll decide this on our ethical grounds. To the companies that were pirating, Rice Tech, Monsanto, Grace, they wrote, people are desperate sometimes. Even in our village they steal, but usually they steal bread if they're hungry. They steal something else if their mother is ill and they have to pay for treatment. We normally bring them to the collective under the tree and ask them to explain their desperation, so that with justice we can take care of their need. If they're hungry, we can give them food. If their mother is ill, we can collectively raise money for treatment. Please come to us and sit under the banyan tree in our village and explain to us your desperation. Why you must steal this common good. It had such huge impact. Michael Moore, who was then the Director General of WTO, came to India to meet me. He said, I've been told by the Indian ambassador that you must have a hand in this. And I said to him, you've got letters from the villages, right? He said, yes. I said, go to those villages, talk to the 6,000 villagers. Why are you talking to me? This is about living democracy. It's not about a dead democracy. And those kind of creative action have become very, very important again. I would definitely say build a campaign on the issue of the biodiversity, access to biodiversity, but contextualize it in the rights of Mother Earth, that we are part of an Earth family, and contextualize it in the Convention on Biological Diversity, out of which this law arises, in which there is an Article 8J, which is on indigenous knowledge and the sovereignty of local communities, which they've constantly avoided. That the sovereignty over biodiversity is of the biodiversity itself and of the local communities, not of the state. So those are movements you can build as part of this transition we are discussing. We need to continue to question the patenting of seed and life, and there are strong movements on no patents on seed, including the Seed Freedom Campaign, and there's a fat book out there. And we got governments to challenge this in the WTO. But that was all squashed. There are piles of papers sitting undecided. I think we definitely need more movements for solidarity to reclaim seed and biodiversity as a common good, creating seed banks, conservation systems. Every year now, to create more participation and more awareness, we celebrate a fortnight of seed freedom, food freedom, and earth democracy. From 2nd October, Gandhi's birth anniversary, to 16th October, World Food Day. The details will be available on the website of seedfreedom.in. Do build up. As part of your dealing with the biodiversity law, the Seed Freedom Campaign. The final thing I would say is, because I've been given all these things with climate change and the 21st COP next year, September, here in Paris, I think we need to make bigger connections as movements between biodiversity, biopiracy, and climate change. Because after all, the corporations are responding to climate change through biopiracy. We need to respond to climate change through reclaiming the commons of the atmosphere, but also the commons of our seeds and our plants and our knowledge. For this very simple action that we've been promoting, and the flyer out there of Navdanya says, Seeds of Freedom, Gardens of Hope. Because organic farming is the single biggest solution to climate change. And I know 5,000 kilometers of bicycle riding will take place. But somewhere the bicyclists will have to stop. When they stop, they should plant seeds and start a garden, so that the bicycle gets connected to celebrating life on earth and solutions that people can offer. And I think it's going to be a very busy but very exciting year here in France from now to next September. biopiracy patent is really a piece of paper, and its power is in the threat to say, I have a patent, you can't do this. So the resistance is in the power of building up multiple sources of saying, but this is not an invention, this is knowledge that has been held in the past. So published literature, community biodiversity registers, celebration of seed, all of that is a mobilization against biopiracy.
Historical.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Now, on the issue of will it be accepted or not, I want to mention that on the one hand there's this appropriation and monopolization of the biodiversity of the world through biopiracy. On the other hand, there's an attempt to criminalize those who have access to biodiversity. The seed law of Europe, which was sent back by Parliament, drafted by the European Commission, is designed to criminalize biodiversity. Now, if you look at how they work, they make uniformity a privilege when diversity is the way local seeds evolve. They make scientific publication an imperative, whereas a farmer who bred a particularly good variety of tomato will never have a scientific description, but he knows that this is a unique tomato. So all of this is attempts to reinforce the monopoly. And that is why we must never settle for the standards and criteria created by industry to measure what is reliable knowledge. France is particularly important in this because Lima Grain, who's a partner of Monsanto, sued Cocopelli, which saves seeds. Like we save seeds in India, they sued Cocopelli. And they said that Cocopelli is stealing their market by existing and by distributing seed. The case went to the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice, the public prosecutor ruled and said biodiversity protection is an obligation. And they're doing the right thing. Because under the Convention on Biological Diversity, we have to protect biodiversity. But the judges ruled and said diversity lowers food production, which it does not. We have a report here that shows that through diversity we increase nutrition and food production. It lowers food production, therefore it's a threat to food security. Therefore the only seeds allowed in the market should come from companies. Very unjust ruling. I don't know why there wasn't an outrage, why there wasn't a movement in Europe against this ruling. But it's really about who will be stronger, the bullying of the corporations or the power of the people. In feminism, I want to read out to you an old writing by Johann Jakob Bachofen. It says, the triumph of paternity brings with it the liberation of the spirit from the manifestations of nature, a sublimation of human existence over the laws of material life. Maternity pertains to the physical side of man, the only thing he shares with animals. The paternal spiritual principle belongs to him alone. Triumphant paternity partakes of the heavenly light, while childbearing motherhood is bound up with the earth that bears all beings. This is the thinking behind capitalist patriarchy. If you look at Bacon, he was connected to some spiritual sphere. You look at John Locke and creation of private property, it's not the work of the woman or the work of the peasant, but the work, spiritual work of the owner of capital. It's all connected. Capital is spiritual. Spiritual life is material. So, when I talk of ecofeminism, I'm basically talking about this perverted thinking that has allowed the rise of capitalist patriarchy and the rise of capital over nature and the ownership and privatization of life on earth. I'm not an essentialist. I do not believe women are genetically and biologically more caring. I believe men and women can be caring. In tribal societies, both are. In tribal societies, you'll never see the baby only in the hands of the mother. Baby will move across the community in the hands of tribal societies. My own region in the Himalaya, the men are cooking half the time. Cooking is not women's work. All of this has been defined as the rise of the market defined women into the home and then said working in the home is not production. GDP says if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. Now the seed produces itself, so it doesn't produce. But when Monsanto has a patented seed, it produces. Women produce, but because they produce for the family, they don't produce. When a Coca-Cola brings you a junk drink, it's productive. So they're very, very deep perversions. Gandhi always said a prayer may make me more womanly. Now, womanly is basically a summary of caring and sharing. Women have been left through the division of labor to take care of sustenance, which you can only do through caring and sharing. We've now reached a moment where men and women should make a transition to a culture and economy of caring and sharing. Because the greed economy is destroying the earth and destroying our lives. Lives of men and women, and first women are hit. Women are like the canary in the gold mine. They're affected first. But when they're affected negatively, all of society will be. We make connections with other movements. But, the time has to be right. I've done lots of meetings with open source software communities. There's something called Red Hat. Mm-hmm. I've done trainings for them. That open source software, open source seed, the logic is the same. A Microsoft patenting software and a Monsanto patenting seed are the same, and in fact they're one. They work very closely together, and Gates Foundation has huge shares in Monsanto. The two are converging. When I talked about patenting climate resilience, it's software being used to patent seeds and life forms. It is about privatization, and we connect. We connect the issue of biopiracy to the issue of privatization of water, to the privatization of public goods. But as I said, the platform has to be the right platform. If you keep repeating everything all the time, even in platforms where it's not appropriate, it doesn't build movements. Movements are built when there's a dialogue, when receiving and giving is in mutual proportion. Yes, at the end of it, it's all about culture. So when we wrote those postcards, they were cultural acts. The fact of biopiracy is done through legal mechanism of patenting. The resistance to biopiracy is a cultural movement of reclaiming the common good. If we can also fight legally, fine, but we don't have to depend only on that. On the universities, I want to mention.
It's all left to the universities.
Yeah, but you see, what's happened is part of the same common issue of enclosure of the commons and privatization of the public good is universities have been told the public can't support you. Government money won't support you. Go find your funding from corporations. And when corporations become one with researchers in the university, the patent might be taken by a researcher in the university, but the working of the patent is done by the company. Because scientists will never be in commerce. I want to read out to you from a book on what patenting and IPR did to universities. In the past, it was the most natural thing in the world for colleagues to swap ideas on the spur of the moment, to share the latest findings, hot off the scintillation counter, to show each other early drafts. No more. Intellectual property rights means you shut yourself off from communication with your students and your colleagues. Your only communication is with the corporations. It is part of the privatization of the public good. When you ask what do we do, the first thing is we have to connect the dots. Connect the dots. Right. The GMO movement has been treated as separate from the biopiracy movement, has been treated as separate from the defense of the common good, has been treated as different from sustainable farming. The reason we started Seed Freedom was to connect the dots. We said people who save seeds, people who fight patents, people who deal with law, people who work with farming communities, they are all part of one larger movement. They might focus on one part of it, but it is all connected. And when I said biodiversity should get connected to the climate discussion, because so far the climate discussion it's been reduced to energy, not how we produce food. But food production at the industrial level is 40% of the climate problem. 40%. So the biggest solution is organic food and saving biodiversity. So connecting the dots is very important.
Alors, il y avait une autre question là. Est-ce que je peux juste voir s'il y a d'autres questions ou remarques concises? Donc, vas-y.
Thanks for coming. First, I was wondering, do you think the states could help to achieve that, or protect biodiversity by confronting companies, like Indian states or French states? Because obviously on the international level, as you were saying with the WTO, it's mostly foreign interests. But do you think the states, which are supposed to represent public interests, could help to fight these big companies? And does your organization work with Indian states towards this goal?
I'm just going to see if there are any last questions. Dernier appel pour des questions, remarques courtes.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, we'll have more detail about volunteers for monitoring biopiracy we spoke about.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The WTO is actually based on the states. It's controlled by the corporations, but the membership is states. Also, when the corporate industry takes over, it's the government in Paris it controls, or the government in Delhi. So the real changes are coming at the regional level. When European Commission was saying bring GMOs, it was the 50 regions, including the region of Brittany, which said we will not accept GMOs in our region. 50 regions legally made a network and said we will not allow it. That's what has held Europe GMO free. Now, of course, England is creating havoc, it's changing laws. Their environment minister is the biggest pusher of GMOs, Owen Peterson.
Yep.
So, of course, he's not going to protect, but regions can, counties can. Just like we created 50 regions for GMO free, I think we need to create 50 regions for seed sovereignty and biodiversity sovereignty and against biopiracy. So that was stopping the bad. This has to be defending the positive, the common good. And if one region takes on, then other regions will take on. And wherever there's GMO free, this is a natural complement to that movement. I work with a number of states in India on the transition to GMO free status and organic. I work with the government of Bhutan. I work a lot with, as I said, European regions. It depends what's the level at which you can. The closer the level to people, which means the more local, the easier it is to act. In terms of volunteers, I'd like to mention that Navdanya has internship program. We run in Earth University. In September we will run an A to Z of agroecology, but we offer courses. It's available on the website. In terms of volunteering, it's something, of course, that you'd have to do here. What we can do is, for India we can do it, we'll give you a set of publications on Ayurvedic knowledge. And then all you have to do is go to the patent base of the European Patent Office, of WIPO, and the US Patent Office. And it's a very simple task. Open the book, this plant, patent, and then you create a list and a more. And through this, don't just leave it at that. Then work on the solidarity. Work on building these partnership economies. That is what we are talking about in terms of a transition. Let's pick 5 things on which a cooperative arrangement can bring benefits to the French as well as increase the benefits of local communities while defending their sovereignty.
Je dis merci à Vandana. Thanks, Vandana. Donc, Pour les groupes de travail, on va devoir utiliser cet espace. Donc, je propose que on fait un groupe qui va dans ce coin-là, un groupe qui va dans ce coin-là et ici. Il y a 3 groupes de travail, en sachant que le tremplin des travaux, ça va être un petit peu différent à chaque fois. Mais le contenu des travaux et sur les résultats visés, c'est à travailler ensemble sur les alternatives collectives et individuelles. Donc, pour le groupe, le premier groupe A, qui va A pour Archibald. Donc, Archibald, c'est le jeune homme là. Il va être dans le coin là. Il va lancer les discussions sur les alternatives en parlant du plaidoyer qu'on fait à la Fondation sur cette fameuse loi, projet de loi biodiversité qui est en cours en ce moment. Donc ça, c'est un atelier qui est plutôt avec une entrée plaidoyer, campagne de sensibilisation, mais qui peut tourner, enfin l'angle de départ n'est pas forcément l'angle de la fin. Un deuxième groupe, c'est avec François, donc dans ce coin-là. Et ça va être sur la campagne Seeds of Freedom, donc la campagne de Vandana et de Solidarité. Donc une campagne plutôt de sensibilisation et de mobilisation. Donc ça peut répondre un petit peu à certaines des questions qui étaient posées. Donc Seeds of Freedom Campaign dans ce coin-là avec François. Et moi-même, je serai dans le coin-là. Et moi, j'ai un panier d'alternatives comme tremplin pour vous, qui inclut 5-6 idées d'alternatives, dont une toute petite présentation de la bibliothèque numérique de connaissances traditionnelles dont parlait Vandana par rapport au volontariat.